This is the Automobile and the Airplane Objective 2 about how the automobile, after it was invented, revolutionized American life. Now, obviously, after what we talked about in the first objective, you could see how the automobile revolutionized American life already. It created a series of new jobs in a new industry called the automobile industry. Henry Ford's quadricycle and Model T, as well as the contributions of Ransom Olds, eventually lead to an assembly line concept that's going to affect the world in terms of a business model, and Fordism, creating that high-quality product while taking care of your workers, also had a huge legacy on the world. But going beyond that, going just in terms of the overall economy itself, I believe that the automobile is the single biggest reason for the economic boom of the Roaring '20s after World War I. The 1920s is one of the most significant economic decades in our history, and the automobile is at the center of that, creating 6 million new jobs in various industries. So many things were tied to the automobile and how it drove the economy that it's got to be considered one of the most important inventions in American history. Now, of course, many of those 6 million new jobs are going to be in the automobile industry itself, but think of the things and the parts that go into an automobile and how those industries would be improved as well. For example, automobiles are made of steel. So the more automobiles that were being produced, and we gave you the numbers in the last objective as to how many that was, 500,000 by 1914, 20 million by 1930. When you think about those numbers and how much steel it would take to produce vehicles, well, demand for steel went up across the board, so it had to be supplied, which meant you had to hire a lot of steel workers, putting money in their pockets, and they were going to spend in a lot of areas across the country as well. It's the old classic spending cycle. Demand for one product goes up, then the supply and employment and demand for, therefore, other products goes up as well. But obviously it wasn't just steel. There are other parts to a vehicle. For example, it's got to run on something, so the oil industry, remember the volatile, wasteful byproduct they had from refining oil into kerosene? Well, the oil industry benefited greatly and started employing way more people than it ever had before to provide gasoline for cars. The rubber industry back in those days really had never boomed before, but cars needed tires. So a lot of jobs, a lot of people were being hired working in rubber plants, coming up with tires for these vehicles, and money was being put in their pockets, and they were going to spend in other areas. The glass industry as well, for the windshields, they were hiring people across the board. The fabric and leather industries for the interiors of the vehicles, that also boomed as people across the board were hired to produce these materials for the inside of cars. The transportation and commerce industries were also affected by the advancement of the automobile. The more cars you had, the more trucks you were eventually going to build. And pretty soon things didn't have to be shipped across the country by train, they could be taken by truck. Now obviously the early trucks weren't as big as this in the shipping industry, but the bottom line was the more trucks you build, the more businesses need them, and that again is going to improve the steel, oil, rubber, glass, fabric, and leather industries, employing even more people, and employing truck drivers as everybody starts to switch from transporting their goods by train to transporting them by truck. Not to mention the food and farming industries. This is a Fordson tractor right here. You can see the label on the side. The Ford Auto Company got involved in a lot of tractor production, and having those tractors made harvesting much more efficient, planting much more efficient. It basically put a lot of people to work in the agricultural industry as well. Not to mention road construction. At the turn of the century, some of the early vehicles had a hard time getting around because there were only 10 miles of paved road in the entire country. Think about that for a second. In 1900, 10 miles of paved road in the entire nation. Most of those centered around the city of Detroit, where the automobile makers were needing paved roads to test out their new products. Eventually, with the advent of the automobile, you're going to have to hire a lot of workers to start clearing out paths and start creating roadways. the amount of jobs that created and the amount of money that was put into workers' pockets so they could spend in other areas is almost immeasurable when you take a look at the number of highways that popped up around the country in the early 1900s all the way into the 1920s and even up to 1956 as we needed more and more roads to accommodate for automobile traffic. The overall construction industry also benefited from gas stations and also the new hotel for motorists, the motel. Now this picture is from the 1950s, but motels had been around since the 1920s. And every time a gas station went up, or every time a motel went up, there needed to be continued road construction nearby. There needed to be a huge boom in the lumber and the glass and the steel and the roofing industries. There were jobs all over the place as America continued to expand because of this ripple effect in the automobile production that was happening. And of course, don't forget about the advertising industry. As people started to go up and down America's newfound highways, advertisers started finding ways to sell products by putting up billboards on the side of the road. Now you look at all the paint and the construction and the hiring of putting these up, it wasn't just people in the advertising industry that were experiencing a boom and getting new jobs. It was all the people that physically had to put these billboards on the side of the road. So there are literally anywhere from 1 to 11 or maybe even more ways that the automobile directly creates 6 million new jobs in various industries in this country. It's the sole reason. We have 6 million more people that have money in their pockets to spend. Demand for all sorts of products is going to go up. And those products will have to be supplied. And more people will have to be put to work to supply those products, and they will spend. It's the classic spending cycle, and in the early 1900s and into the 1920s, it was driven almost completely by the automobile. Now, as far as a social revolution, I mean, that's all the economic side, but socially the automobile provided for a major cultural revolution as well. The social revolution of the automobile basically consists of this, the idea of freedom. For the first time in history, Americans could really go anywhere, anytime they wanted to. They weren't just subjected to the house or having to hitch up the wagon and go slowly for an afternoon trip that might only be 5 miles away. The car lets you move a little bit faster and a little bit easier, and you could go for your day trips in a shorter amount of time. It basically opened up America for people to go wherever they wanted to, whenever they wanted to. As a result, we started seeing more consolidated schools, more churches, more social interaction. But there were also some effects that people might have considered to be somewhat negative as well. If you take a look here on this old model, you'll see in the back here, this is called a rumble seat. If you pop open the back there, a seat pops up from the back where you could basically sit back there and ride along with the drivers. They really weren't making a whole lot of models with back seats to them, so the rumble seat was kind of the convertible. Now, the rumble seat is kind of a classic thing in American automobile technology back in the day, and it would probably be kind of fun for the kids to jump back there and feel the wind in their hair or whatever the case may be as the car was moving along. In a lot of ways, the rumble seat was fun for kids, but also for the adults as well. There were various newspaper articles by the time you got to the 1920s that were describing the rumble seat as a house of prostitution on wheels. You can only imagine the kind of fun that the adults were having in the rumble seat. And as a result, the automobile, in this particular sense, led to some people saying that there was a decline in moral values. In this case, the automobile wasn't very good. And I think I just want to move off of this topic as soon as I possibly can. The other way that the automobile was really good by the 1950s is that it made suburbia possible. You remember we talked about suburbia in the first unit of the class and how people were moving out to the suburbs and experiencing the quote-unquote good life. Well, the automobile, cheaply built, made it possible for more than one person in the family to have that, and made it possible to commute from the cities to the rural areas, again promoting this idea of freedom. But there were some bad sides to it as well. Very early on, it was noticeable that people couldn't necessarily always handle properly riding around in vehicles. Some of the early models, some of the early drivers were involved in numerous single car accidents that might be something as simple as running into a tree to, I don't know what happened here, but obviously not paying very much attention. By the time you start getting into the late 20s and early 30s, single car crashes and multi-car crashes were becoming more and more common, and the idea that the automobile could be kind of a rolling coffin was becoming a little bit more prevalent. As time continued on, more and more people were getting killed in car accidents, and by the time you hit 1951, the 1 millionth American dies from an automobile accident. So over the course of that time, this is kind of a negative influence as a social revolution. The idea that cars could bring death and that automobile accidents were going to become more and more prevalent. Again, by 1951, the 1 millionth American died from an auto accident. That is more, and I want you to be aware of this, that is more than had died in all American wars combined to that point. Going back to the 1700s, more people died in automobile accidents from the inception of the automobile to 1951 than had died in every war we had ever fought combined up to that point. Pretty telling statistic. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.